Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. And for my cards for today, my original plan was to stamp this image onto watercolor paper and then do traditional watercoloring. But things kind of took on a mind of their own, and I ended up making 3 cards on dark cardstock. I have Simon Says Stamp's Midnight Green, Soft Navy, and Black cardstock here, and each piece is already cut down to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And I'm using the WPlus9 Christmas Rose Bouquet stamp set that I absolutely love. I just love it. So I had so many ideas, and there's so many things I wanted to do, mostly involving some form of watercolor because these images are just perfect for it. But I ended up deciding to stamp these onto the dark cardstock. So I'm using my MISTI here because I'm going to do the multiples, and I use my anti-static powder tool on the cardstock. And for this midnight green piece, I'm using Avery Elle's rose gold embossing powder. Really pretty. This is one of the few embossing powders that honestly, it looks basically like it does in the container. It just becomes a little more metallic when you melt it. Whereas most embossing powders, you know, they change as you melt them. So I just thought I would mention that because it's just different. I really love it. So I did the rose gold on the green, and then on the soft navy cardstock, I inked up the stamp again, stamped it with my Versamark ink. And then I'm pouring over Avery Elle's silver embossing powder. And all of these, I'm just setting them aside and doing just one after another. And then I'll melt everything all at once. So then for the black cardstock, use my anti-static powder tool, re-inked up the stamp with the Versamark ink, and then I'm using the Avery Elle gold embossing powder. And I could, honestly, in a way, you could almost leave it just like that. Like the gold or the metallic embossing powders over the dark cardstock, it's so pretty. But I, obviously, if you've seen the pictures already, I showed them at the beginning of the video, I went all out with like the metallic and the shimmer and the pearlescent because I was having so much fun. So I melted everything with my heat tool, and doing it all back to back, that also helps because it gets the heat tool good and hot. So then everything just melts quickly. So I've got all of my metallic embossed images here on this cardstock. And once everything's melted, I let it cool off for it doesn't take long, like a few seconds. And I'm going to use my Swiffer cloth to remove all that anti-static powder, because when you work on dark cardstock, the anti-static powder leaves all that white residue all over it, which isn't very pretty. And I find the Swiffer cloth is one of the best ways to really help remove that residue. So I wiped all of my card fronts here to remove that. I also will sometimes like rub my hands on the cardstock, and that really helps. So get all of that removed, and then I pulled out all of the Finetec palettes I have. I have 3 of them. They released a 4th one. Simon just got it in. That's more all golds. I have these other 3 that I showed a long time ago. I've done already a couple videos. That's kind of what inspired all this. Using these on dark cardstock because I just love it. There are other palettes out there with metallic watercolors that are not as pricey as these. These are pricier, but these are so fabulous. I just love them. So I'm using the larger palette for my first card, and just decided to go kind of traditional, like red on the main, like poinsettia flower, and then go from there. So I sprayed the colors I was planning on using with just a spray bottle. These, because they are metallic and pearlescent watercolors, just the nature of it, it usually helps to get them wet ahead of time, or like you spray them with water, etc., and let it kind of sink in a tiny bit, or you have to work it up with a brush. These, unlike some other metallic watercolors, these do work up very easily. Some of the cheaper ones I have, you have to kind of work a little harder to really get the pigment going, and the pigment likes to settle really quickly, etc., but almost anything will work. These are fabulous though. The minute I started painting this onto the navy cardstock, and it's hard to show on camera and in photos and whatnot, but it's just gorgeous. Love. And very simple. Like my original idea of doing this on watercolor paper, I was going to do layers of watercolor and, the darker areas and blending and all that stuff, which it ends up resulting in a beautiful image. But this is simple. It's like stamp, emboss, apply color. Blending needed, nothing. Like really simple. Even though this isn't watercolor paper, it's totally fine with using these on it because I'm not working the brush. I'm not getting everything really, really wet. I'm not blending colors, anything like that. So the cardstock is fine. I've never had a problem using these, or I have that Prima metallic little watercolor set that I've shown in many videos. I've never had a problem with any of it doing things like this. Like even when I use a little bit more water, which I did on these other flowers, it still works fine. It's when you're really rubbing that brush back and forth and trying to, you know, add too much water and that sort of stuff, that's when the cardstock can start to pill. But doing this, it's fine. So really quick and easy. If I was just doing one card, I would have been done a heck of a lot quicker. But because I did 3 different cards with 3 different color combos, 3 different palettes, 3 different types of embossing powders, I kind of created a little bit of a mess for myself, and it took a fair bit longer, but it was so much fun to see all these different colors and just the effects on the different cardstock. I really had a ton of fun doing this, and if I had the time, I would have made like 100 of these because they were just fun. Like if you stuck to kind of one color palette, you could do multiples of these really quickly, I think, because like I said, it's very simple coloring. You know, you're just applying the color. You don't have to really think too much. So after I did the blue one, I'm going on to the black cardstock, and I'm using this more gold metallic palette. Like I said, there is a new one that has mostly golds. I'm actually glad I have this one because this copper color is absolutely fabulous. I think this was the first time I used this copper color, and it's beautiful on dark cardstock. I just love it. So I started with that one, and then I kind of worked my way to the other colors to fill in the rest of this. Just fun is all I can say. I was using a silver size 8 brush. With this, the type of brush doesn't matter. You don't need a fancy brush. This was just the one I happened to grab, but more often than not when I'm working with these Finetec palettes or any metallic watercolors, I just grab any of my brushes. My little cheap Ranger brush set works fabulous with these two because again, it's just laying down the color. It doesn't need anything fancy in my opinion. But this was the one I grabbed and it was doing a fabulous job. These do hold a lot more color. If you've ever, you know, played around with watercolor and different types of brushes, these silver brushes do hold a lot more. So I'm able to load the brush up with color like how I'm doing with the gold here. I load it up once and I'm able to paint every single one of those leaves without having to re-dip back into that pan. So that's kind of one of the perks of having some of the nicer brushes, but it's definitely not necessary. So I got all the color applied to this one, and then I fell in love with this one. First I loved the blue one, and then I loved the black one. It was just like, I was just having a blast. So did that one, and then my final one is the green here, and I'm using the Iridescent palette. And this one I've used the most out of all my palettes because this one is just the most unique. All of the swatches on the top of the palettes, that was on the box. I mentioned this in a previous video when I used these. I cut it off the box and I actually glued it to the top of my palettes because especially with this one, how they look in the pan is nothing like how they look on dark cardstock because these are the ones that have like the duochrome pigments. So they look completely different on light versus dark cardstock. And of all the palettes, this one too, because of the nature of the pigments in this iridescent palette, when everything is dry, it has almost like a chalk look to it. I won't say a chalk texture because nothing rubs off, but it has a chalk look to it. It looks almost powdery and very flat, but the minute the light hits it, that's when it literally looks like it's glowing in the dark, and I just absolutely love it. So for me, it does not bother me in the least that it will have that chalky look when the light's not hitting it. I have had people ask me though if there was something wrong with their palettes because they got it and they really didn't like that, so I thought I would mention it. You can see it later on in the video a little bit, how it has that weird chalky texture. It also happens more when you apply it very thickly, which is what I did here. I applied it quite heavy. So it does kind of, as it dries, it just has that look. But again, the minute the light hits it, the color just, that duochrome just pops and it's so much fun. So really, I can't pick a favorite out of these three. I loved all of them. They were so much fun. And just with the different embossing powders and just everything, how it all tied together. These were just, so far, some of the most favorite cards I made in terms of having loads of fun creating them. So after everything was dry, I die cut all these pieces with the largest of the My Favorite Things A2 rectangle, stitched rectangle stacks, set 2. And then I pulled out the Simon Says. This is a previous release of glitter cardstock, not their newest 6x6 packs. These are the 8.5 by 11 packs that they released previously. And I used all three because the colors I thought would go really great with the background. So I cut down 3 pieces to 4 1/4 by 5.5 and just set everything aside. While I was doing all my coloring, I was really in my head wondering how I was going to add a sentiment to this. I didn't want to cover, I didn't want to do a strip of vellum. I really wanted, not to cover any of that metallic watercoloring I did. And ended up deciding on using the WPlus9 Be Merry sentiments that I have had for a couple years now. I think it's been at least a couple years. And it just happened to fit in the lower corner, which was perfect. So I did the same thing, set everything up on my MISTI in the lower right corner there, used my anti-static powder tool, and then used the same embossing powders for each image and doing the exact same thing. So anti-static powder tool, stamped the sentiment with Versamark ink, poured over the coordinating embossing powder, set it aside, moved on to the next one. So I did all 3 and then melted all 3 with my heat tool and then removed all the anti-static powder with my Swiffer cloth. So I've got everything is now stamped, has its sentiments, and then of course I have to add some splatter. Same thing. While I was working on these, I was thinking about what I was going to do for splatter. Would I just do metallic splatter? Was I going to do my standard Copic white splatter? Of course, the Copic white won out. I was going to do both, like add some white splatter and then add a little bit of metallic as well. I thought that would look really pretty, but in the end, I changed my mind on that. So I just took a little bit of Copic opaque white, put it on my acrylic block, watered it down, and then flicked the edge of another brush against the edge of the acrylic block and created a bit of splatter. That just, gave it that little something. They're Christmas cards. I'm thinking snow. It wouldn't even matter. It doesn't matter if it's Christmas. I'm using that as my excuse right now. I get some grief from people for how often I add splatter. Although some of you understand me, and then I get comments it's like, what? No splatter? I'm kind of obsessed. I can't help it. So splattered everything, set it all aside to dry, worked on my card bases, which is Simon's Ivory cardstock. So all these pieces cut to 4 1/4 by 11. So I'm scoring all of them at 5.5 with my Teflon bone folder. So they will be top folding A2 sized cards. So get those scored and folded and press down that fold with my Teflon bone folder. And then I'm going to go back to my MISTI here and start lining up the card bases in my MISTI. And I'm using more sentiments from that same Be Merry sentiment set. So I lined up the Sending Love to You and Yours. So I get those all lined up, make sure they're straight, close the lid of my MISTI, and then I'm going to do this process yet again. And see, this is where this was taking longer because I'm doing everything with 3 different colors of embossing powder. So I literally had 3 different coffee filters because when you're using different colors of embossing powder, you don't want to mix those powders. You don't want, grains of the rose gold and the silver, etc. So I've got 3 different coffee filters that I was using throughout this whole thing, making sure to keep everything separate. So I would stamp, pour over the embossing powder, go on to the next one, use the other embossing powder, etc., until all 3 had all of their respective embossing powders on, and then melt that with my heat tool. So if you used one embossing powder, like chose one color palette to stick to, one color of embossing powder to stick through, this would go a lot faster. But regardless, I was kind of loving the different color combos. So to adhere my metallic watercolored embossed card fronts to that glitter paper, I'm using my Xyron Mega Runner. Normally, I cut out the center of glitter cardstock like this. I've shown that tons of times to conserve it because you're covering most of it up. But because I was adhering that watercolor or the card front directly to the glitter paper, I didn't want to cut out the center because it would actually end up creating ridges when you send this through the mail. A way to avoid that is to cut out the center of the glitter paper to save it for another project and then use foam tape or craft foam. That kind of helps alleviate that, which is what I do 99% of the time. But this time I wanted to just adhere everything really flat. And the Xyron Mega Runner is amazing to adhere cardstock to glitter paper because usually when you adhere anything to glitter paper, you have to be really careful about the adhesive you use because more often than not, it'll just fall off. Like it has a hard time adhering to the glitter. This Simon Says glitter paper, though, is a little bit different. It's hard to explain. It's a different sort of finish to it. So it's very easy to adhere over it. And the Mega Runner is insanely strong. I showed there a second ago when I adhered the blue card front, I'd actually adhered it upside down to my card. I moved fast enough off camera and was able to like wiggle it off the card base and rotate it. But after a few minutes, this adhesive really starts to set in, and now I made these cards yesterday, so there's no pulling them apart now. Like, it will tear all this cardstock if I tried to pull these apart. I've been really impressed with the Xyron. I have the Mega Runner, and then I have the small little handheld tape runner that I've been using a lot lately. And I am just really loving this adhesive. It works so well, and it adheres insanely well. So I layered all of my pieces over their respective glitter papers, and then adhered those to my card bases. So I've got all of my card fronts here. I could leave it as is. Like, these look fabulous as is with the splatter and the metallic and everything, but I had to add one last embellishment. This is why I didn't do the metallic splatter. I wanted to add some Studio Caudia jewels to all of these. So normally I would do the metallic splatter, but either or, I just wanted to use these jewels because they're just gorgeous. So I used the onyx on the black cardstock, of course. Again, doesn't really show up much in the video, but in real life, like, the light kind of shines off the edges of them and it's really pretty. So I used the onyx on the black card front, and then I used the iridescent clear on this green one, and it picked up that like pink and the shimmer and everything. It was so perfect. I love when things just all come together. And then for the blue card front, I used the silver foil sequins, which played off the silver embossing powder, and that finished off all of these cards. I had so much fun making them. I hope you guys enjoyed this overly long video. I will have links to everything I used in the description box below the video. There you can see in the middle, I'm like distracted, how it looks a little chalky, that middle card. That's what I was talking about. It looks chalky, but the minute the light hits it, and in real life, it's just beautiful. So I'm totally okay with it. So, like I was saying, links to everything in the description box below the video, as well as on my blog. I'll have the photos on my blog, links to the supplies, etc., etc. So check that out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching, subscribing, thumbs upping, and commenting on my videos. And I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!